This is a gift first and foremost to Mrs. Nancy, and it is because the cultural differences of how we start out as children. We raise our children different culturally, and I want to start out by saying I was never raised to be disrespectful to my elders. And a lot of times I grew up in disagreement. Don't ask me how, but just knowing that I disagree with some people, but it didn't matter to my mother. And it certainly is not comely for a child to be talking to an adult the way that they do. But in some cultures, like how this man just decides now to squeak his door and come out of his room, because he does that. He gets to moving around to eavesdrop. And he is disrespectful in that regard because nobody put me here for him specifically, but now he wants to use the microwave all day long. It has been certain specific things that I've been doing that not long after he'll come out. But some people I realize are different from my mom and my parents and my way of growing up. So to before I get into the gift of what I'm, by the way, that man doesn't. I don't think he has, despite having the appearance of having his own IP address or computer, with his name in bold capitals. I don't believe that he actually has one because whenever I do certain protocols to protect my own web presence online, he gets moving around, and then he ultimately gets very quiet, which means that he doesn't have one to use. And the way to get people off of your back when they are riding you in a close proximity is to ignore all the presence that are on that are claiming to have their own IP address. And if you suspect one of them on that list, go in and click that box that says automatic, connect automatic, because then your computer won't just start acting remotely on somebody's command by your own admission or by the lack of it, thereof. So he's awfully quiet over there, and now that he sees that I'm doing this, he's interested. But he's one of the main culprits of working with espionage groups. The thing that I wanted to point out is that there's different cultures that there's some cultures out there that raise their children to be disrespectful. And I just couldn't understand it when I go on certain uh, initiatives by a brave and wonderful warrior, Miss Nancy Pelosi, how other people are on there verbally abusive. But as I was studying um, in anthropology and observing the cultures, I seen the behavior of children whose culture teaches them the complete opposite of um, being disrespectful directly, especially towards adults, because number one, you'll be looked at as a culprit because you're responding to a child which who would totally um, come at you on a battlefield. And some children will run up, their mother will say go hit her, and the child will run up and punch the adult. What else? They stomp really hard over your head and say, well, they need to have exercise. Well, when you're in a place where the walls are paper thin, even certain walking really hard is for no reason at all can be an offense, a weapon. And last but not least, I see that that it's for purposes such as the ones that I see actively disrespectful to her on pages, not even her own page, but just being on the news and people saying weird things like I can't stand her, or saying all these negative things, but I say that to say this, that the study of anthropology is not to be ignored. That's my major in my 4 year college study, which I only got as far as my to all my concentrations in the area of in that particular area, but only up to my second sophomore year as I begin it in that 4 year college. But I since got into my medical classes, and different cultures just certainly do raise their children for a time such as that, and it is marveling to see that. But I just want to give her this gift. You need to just take a break. It's called The Log of the Grand Turks, and it's one of the books that I had to reacquire because, promoting my museum small business was a brave attribute in of itself, because it included but not limited having all that I was doing put on hold, including where I was living, which I'm back home now. But here is the first grand one and the log with illustrations. And this book is dated 1926 in Boston and New York. Houghton Mifflin Company. So it was one of my really, really delightful reads. And I was very, very excited when I was reading it. But when I had a copy of it from the Rhode Island copy, it still looked like that, like they had the actual copies, and a leather binding, and it looked like some parts was in his handwriting. So, but the preface says, in these days, when steamers and motor ships are gradually driving sailing vessels from the seas, much of the romance of the day of sail has gone forever, and the lover of things marine cherishes all records and chronicles that can be found regarding the ships and sailors of that now rapidly closing era. Ships are like men. Some eke out a humdrum, monotonous existence, while others enjoy a career of adventure and achievement. Yet, the story has been recorded of but few of the many. It is the purpose of these pages to recount the histories of four famous American sailing vessels, each of which had a prosperous and adventurous career in a different important period of our history, and each of which bore the name Grand Turk, quote unquote. The first Grand Turk, a ship of 300 tons, was built at Hanover, Massachusetts in 1781. That's before the War of 1812, during our War of Independence. So that's kind of primitive for us. She was designed as a merchantman, but in view of the troubled times in which she was launched, her owner, alias Haskett Derby of Salem, fitted her with 28 guns and sent her to rove the seas as a privateer. She filled this role with great success and captured many British vessels. After the war, her guns were removed and she became a peaceful trader, making voyages from Salem first to the West Indies, later to the Cape of Good Hope, and finally to China, where she was one of the first ships to display the stars and stripes. By following her voyages, it is possible to obtain a true picture of that romantic period in our history, when diminutive ships laden with cargoes of rum, fish, cheese, and lumber sailed for the distant markets of the Indies and there exchanged these homely products of New England for the spices, teas, and costly fabrics of the East. The second Grand Turk, named after her famous predecessor, was built in Salem in 1791 and through a ship of only 560 tons was nevertheless the largest vessel built in Salem up to that time. She made a voyage to India and one to Russia, and then being found too large for the trade of the port of Salem was sold, and no further record of her can be found. The third Grand Turk, a brig of 300 tons, was built at Wiscasset, Maine, expressly for use as a privateer in the War of 1812. The American privateers in that war were fully as effective as the regular navy in bringing England to terms, and none of these private armed ships had a more brilliant record than the Grand Turk. She created tremendous havoc among British shipping and captured many prizes. A few of her logs are preserved, and from these a good idea of life aboard a privateer can be obtained. After the war, she, like the original Grand Turk, became a peaceful trader and ran between Boston and Mediterranean ports. Over 100 years elapsed before another Grand Turk was sighted upon the high seas. The fourth of this name, a three-masted schooner of 500 tons, was launched at Millbridge, Maine in 1916. Built just before the rise in prices caused by the World War, she enjoyed to the full the benefit of the correspondingly high freights of that period and had an active career of 8 years trading to the West Indies and along the Atlantic coast until she fell a victim to the sunken reefs off the treacherous coast of Yucatan. The stories of the first three Grand Turks can never be completely told, but by piecing together bits from faded old letters and bills of lading, and by studying moldy and discolored ships, logs, and account books, it has been possible to weave a connected narrative which makes those stirring days live again. Note: the material contained in this book has been taken principally from the letters and business papers of Elias Haskett Derby, the owner of the first two Grand Turks, and from logbooks of those ships, which were preserved in the Essex Institute at Salem, Massachusetts. Papers of the privateer brig Grand Turk, owned by the Beverly Historical Society of Beverly, Massachusetts, have also provided much valuable information. William C. Hunter's little book, The Fan Quay at Canton, Before Treaty Days, London, 1882, has been drawn upon for descriptions of life in the early days of the Canton trade, while contemporary newspapers and court records have afforded supplementary materials. Other sources are mentioned in the footnotes. You shouldn't be allowed to eavesdrop like it ain't no tomorrow, but he is. All of a sudden, you gotta go to the bathroom. The story of the first Grand Turks from 1881 to 1883. I'll read one chapter and the contents, and then I will let it be. The Log of the Grand Turks, Chapter 1, the story of the first Grand Turk, 1881 to 1888. At the time of the American Revolution, the town of Salem, Massachusetts was one of the principal communities in the American colonies. A soil none too conducive to agriculture, a seashore abounding with fish, and a dense forest making a barrier to inland progress, and at the same time providing material for building ships. All these led the first settlers in Salem to turn to shipbuilding, fishing, and other marine pursuits. As early as 1660, the English government had sought to protect the trade of her possessions in America by the famous Navigation Acts, which provided that commerce between the colonies and England and between the colonies themselves should be restricted to English and colonial vessels. Thus protected, colonial ships began to carry an increasing portion of the American commerce and soon practically controlled the trade between the different British settlements in America and the West Indies. In fact, so rapidly did colonial shipping increase that the jealousy of the mother country was aroused, and various acts of taxation and restriction were placed on the American trade, beginning with the Molasses Act of 1733. This was followed by the Greenville and Townsend Acts of 1764 to 68 and others, which formed the basis for the slogan, quote, "No taxation without representation," and which eventually brought on the Revolution. It was only natural in a mercantile town like Salem that the English trade restrictions and taxes should arouse great discontent, and that from the very beginning of the Revolution, the people of Salem should have been most active in the American cause. Their activity increased when British cruisers began to seize American ships, among which were many Salem craft. Although an attempt was early made by the Americans to create some kind of navy, it was easy to see that the best they could do would count for very little against England's tremendous naval power. It was not long after the Battle of Lexington, however, that Washington recognized the powerful latent force the Americans had in their merchant ships and sailors. The ship owners had already begun to arm their vessels in self-defense, and soon the government authorities issued licenses to these armed merchantmen to make reprisal on the enemies of the United Colonies of North America, agreeable to the laws and regulations of this country. End quote. Thus, without floating any loans or involving the impecunious government in any expense whatever, there soon appeared on the high seas a swarm of small American armed merchant ships, which, though a navy of a most informal and independent character, nevertheless soon became a force with which the English had seriously to reckon. These privateers were generally fitted out by a shipowner or several shipowners jointly, and usually sailed on what is known even to this day in the fisheries as the quote-unquote half lay or quote-unquote square halves. That is, the owners provided the ship and her equipment and placed a competent captain in charge. The captain hired his own crew and paid the running expenses of the voyage. The enemy vessels and their cargoes, which were captured on the voyage, were brought into an American or an Allied port, and after a hearing before a civil or maritime court, if the vessel and cargoes were judged lawful prizes, they were sold at auction for account of the captors. The proceeds of the sale were then divided, half to the owners of the vessel and half to the captain and his crew. Although frowned on now as a form of piracy, in those days privateering was looked upon as an effective means of harrying the enemy and at the same time a legitimate though perilous method of lining one's own pockets. Of course, many of the privateers came to grief. Lives were lost in these informal and hazardous encounters, and many of the armed ships attacked too strong an adversary and were themselves captured. But it came it can be safely said that these operations of these American privateers during the Revolution caused a serious blow to British shipping. Incidentally, they were the means of greatly enriching many citizens in the seaport towns of the American colonies. Of all the merchants and shipowners of this time, none was more energetic in the support of the American cause or more active in the fitting out of the privateers than Elias Haskett Derby of Salem. He was descended from a family of seafaring people, and his father Richard Derby, after a number of successful trading voyages as captain of small vessels between Salem and West Indies and the Spanish Peninsula, had finally amassed a sufficient capital to set up for himself a merchant in Salem, and by 1775 had a fleet of 6 or 7 small brigs, sloops, and schooners, regularly engaged in the Spanish and West India trade. About this time, Mr. Richard Derby practically retired from the active management of his affairs and returned them all over to his son Elias Haskett Derby. The beginning of the Revolution and the consequent shutting off of many supplies hitherto obtained from England caused prices to rise rapidly, and the great demand for these commodities made it necessary to seek them elsewhere. The Derbys therefore dispatched their little vessels to the various West India islands to exchange New England produce for goods which had been sent out from Europe. Has been sent out there from Europe. The following extract from a letter written by Mr. Derby in February 1776 to one of his captains in the West Indies gives an idea of the hazardous conditions of the trade at that time. If this letter should meet you at the mole, you may ship me by any means. Hex? Hell no. By any vessel bound to Cape Ann, no. Newbury, Ipswich, or near to it, some cotton, cocoa, sugar, molasses, duck, cordage, powder, and other articles you think may answer, as I make no doubt that any goods will make 100%. Whew. But do not send any indigo, as that is contrary to the association. But any foreign goods you have a right to bring. Worsened stockings and middling linen for shirting is at present much wanted, and as is pins, silk and cotton handkerchiefs, and writing paper, all which articles is worth at least 150% more than common, and 150 sterling well laid out, in such articles will leave more profit than any West India goods, but they may not come in a vessel with an English clearance, and neither must any of them be taken from Jamaica, as it would be in direct violation of the association, which I do not mean to break. I've ordered Hallett to throw all the papers over in case he gets taken, but I do not think of losing her, as a schooner sails very fast. If not taken, and if he meets an early wind, as it will be the right season of the year for it, he will stand a good chance to get into some of our harbors on the North Shore, and I am well assured if he does well and he has good cargo of goods, he will make not less than 100% after paying the insurance and charge, which at present is high. I have insured the schooner out, and while she lay in the mole against all risques at 10%. But if she goes to Jamaica, it is to be 5% more, so that the insurance down would not be less than $100. At present, I have not made insurance home, as suppose I cannot at this time get it done under 25%, and shall not make any at present, for by the last account from England, it seems they are tired of this unnatural war. But of that you can form a much better judgment than we can here, as it is seldom we have accounts that are to be depended on. The times at present are such, I cannot determine what will be for the best, and must therefore leave it wholly up to you. Not doubting the business will be conducted with care, should so large a fleet come on this coast in the spring as is talked of, I should think it not best to ship so much to the northward, or otherwise the Lord. But it is now said that commissionaries are appointed to come over to accommodate affairs, but I doubt it. I commit you to the Almighty's protection. They were Christians. No doubting that we shall once again carry on business at Salem in peace and safety, from your friend Elias Haskett Derby. And that's why the words "In God We Trust" is on our dollar bills. I'm having to say that. Although the schooner mentioned in this letter arrived safely in Salem and sold her cargo at a great advantage, Not all of Mr. Derby's ships were so successful. His schooner Jamaica Packet, Captain Ingersoll, while on a passage to Salem from Jamaica, was captured early in 1776 by a British cruiser and carried into Boston. Mr. Derby wrote of this affair as follows, quote, "The captain who took him, i.e., Captain Ingersoll, deprived him of all his papers and kept them until the trial came on, when the bill of stores was missing from the papers. The court condemned 1 cask of rum and 1 cask of sugar for want of the bill of stores, but acquitted the vessel and cargo. Captain Ingersoll could not get leave to sell the cargo. He applied from time to time to have the interest delivered and could not succeed. But after a time, and when the enemy were near leaving Boston, he obtained leave to sell so much of his cargo as would be sufficient to repair the vessel, with a view to leave Boston with the fleet, which he was desirous of doing, hoping that hoping thus to save the interest. When the fleet and army were leaving Boston, they came and took most of the rum on board the transports. The soldiers and sailors and others came in the time of confusion and cut his sails from the yards and made them into bags. They cut the hoops from the hogsheads of sugar and took most of it away. Not being satisfied with that, the day they quitted the town, they came and cut the fastest from the wharf. When the schooner drove down river and went ashore on one of the islands, and was there burned by the British, by which he lost better than 3,000 sterlings." End quote. Soon after this unfortunate incident, 2 more Derby vessels northbound from the West Indies for Salem fell into the hands of the British, and this combination of disasters made Mr. Derby realize that if he wished to keep his ships out of the enemy's hands and also profitably employed, he must give up the role of peaceful trader and meet the enemy at their own game. On June 13, 1776, the Massachusetts Council issued a commission to Captain Peter Lander to command Mr. Derby's schooner Sturdy Beggar, of 90 tons, fitted with 6 carriage guns and a crew of 25 men, quote, "to take reprisals on the enemies of the United States of North America," end quote. This vessel carried no cargo and sailed for no particular port, but set out deliberately to see what British vessels she could find anywhere on the high seas that might be overawed by her 6 carriage guns and induced to surrender themselves and their cargoes. A diligent search through the dusty records fails to reveal any information on the crews of the Sturdy Beggar. Yet, surely, a vessel bearing so jaunty a name must have had a fair share of success. At any rate, Mr. Derby was sufficiently encouraged to embark further in privateering, and in September 1776, in company with another merchant of Salem, he fitted out his West India trader Revenge with 12 guns and sent her off to see what she could find. He was rewarded by having 4 Jamaican vessels fall prey to the Revenge, yielding, quote, 733 hogsheads of sugar, besides other cargo, end quote. Dr. Derby's, however, seems to have been a little cautious at first about going too extensively into this kind of business, and the sturdy beggar and Revenge were the only armed ships he sent out, so far as can be found during the first 2 years of the Revolution. But in the fall of 1777, his name appears as owner or part owner of numerous privateers sailing from Salem, and between that year and 1781, he was interested in no less than 26 of these armed ships. As war progressed and the demand for many necessities of life increased, Mr. Derby began to send some of his vessels out as letters of marque. These vessels engaged in regular commercial voyages carrying cargoes, but at the same time were fully armed and held a commission or quote letter of marque. Letter of marque from the government authorizing them to capture any enemy ships met on their way. Up to this time, none of the Derby fleet was much over 100 tons, the usual size for the West India trade. But the success of Mr. Derby's mercantile ventures on the spoils brought in by his privateers had so increased his capital that he became more ambitious, and in the fall of 1780 he placed an order with Thomas Barstow of Hanover, Massachusetts, for a full-rigged shipment of 300 tons, designed as a fast merchantman, but pierced for an armament of 28 guns. Thomas Barstow was reputed to be one of the best shipbuilders in America at that time, and many well-known craft were built at his Two Oaks yard in the town of Hanover on the Massachusetts South Shore. In order that his interests might be properly protected, Mr. Derby engaged Captain James Gibbel, one of his most trusted shipmasters, to go to Hanover to oversee the new vessels' construction. The latter's accounts show that the ship was largely paid for in goods instead of money. For example, Robert Ailes of Hanover Four Corners wrought the ironwork, took his payment in barrels of rum and firkins of butter sent over from Salem by Mr. Derby. The new ship, destined to be one of the most famous that ever sailed from New England ports, was launched in May 1781, and as she slid down the ways into the narrow waters of the North River, she was christened, quote, Grand Turk. It is a matter of conjecture why Mr. Derby chose this unusual name for his new ship. It may be that he had some particular association with the island of Grand Turk and the Turk Island groups of the Bahamas. No doubt Derby's ships had loaded salt there for New England, as even now schooners load at that island for the Gloucester fishing industry. But while this may have been the origin of the name, Mr. Derby probably selected it for another reason. In those days, the Sultan of Turkey was frequently spoken of as the quote-unquote Grand Turk. and he had the reputation of being the most ferocious of all monarchs. Thus, what could be more awe-inspiring and appropriate name for an armed privateer than that of a Grand Turk? The business of privateering was then at its height. Great numbers of once peaceful merchant seamen and fishermen had found employment on a privateer far more profitable than their former humble callings, and as the Grand Turk was the largest and most strongly armed privateer so far fitted out in Salem, there was little difficulty in obtaining a crew to go in her. In fact, it is said that within 3 days after the notices were posted, more than 100 of the 120 men required had signed her articles. On June 13, 1781, a commission was issued to the ship Grand Turk of 28 carriage guns and 120 men to cruise against the enemies of the United States, quote unquote, under the command of Captain Thomas Simmons. The Grand Turk sailed on her first cruise in the latter part of June, but no details of the voyage remain other than a statement covering the sale of the British brigs Defiance and Venus captured by the Grand Turks on this cruise. This account shows the two prizes to have netted one hundred, not 100, 1,504. I don't know what that sign is. Pounds could be 2S and 6D, half to Mr. Derby and half to Captain Simmons and his crew. The next trace of the Grand Turks is found in a commission issued to her on September 29, 1781, to cruise once more against, quote unquote, the enemies of the United States, but this time under Captain Joseph Pratt. She sailed on her second voyage, October the 26th, 1781, and making her way across the Atlantic directly for the enemy's waters, boldly took up her station off the southern coast of Ireland. It was not long before the English ship Mary, homeward bound from Jamaica, hove in sight, and the crew of the Britisher, little expecting to meet an American armed ship off the British Isles, were completely taken aback when a shot from the Grand Turk came whizzing through their rigging. The Yankee privateer presented so formidable an appearance, with her many guns and her deck full of men, that the Mary surrendered without the least resistance. Captain Joseph Pratt. And Salem Harbor in 1790, showing Derby Wharf at the left. And in a short time, a prize crew from the Grand Turk were swarming up her side and taking charge. The capture was made well in sight of the Irish coast, not far from Queenstown, and therefore the crew of the Mary were told to take to their boats and row for land. Captain Pratt naturally was anxious to get away from so dangerous a locality as quickly as possible before the British cruisers in the channel got wind of the capture, and so, with his prize crew on board the Mary, the two vessels laid a course in the direction of Bilbao on the northern coast of Spain. They had not been long on their way when a small brig was sighted, which upon their approach showed her British colors. Immediately, a shot came flying across her bow as the Grand Turk broke out the stars and stripes and bore down upon her. She did not make the least resistance and surrendered at once to this formidable adversary. The prize crew from the Grand Turk boarded her and found her to be the British brig John and Grace with a cargo of fish. The three vessels then proceeded on their way toward Bilbao. Oh wait, a prize. All right. Before the Grand Turk left, sailor Mr. Derby had given Captain Pratt a letter of introduction to Messrs. Jose Gardoki and Sons of Bilbao, with whom the Derby had done business for 30 years or more, and he had instructed Captain Pratt to take into Bilbao any prizes that might be captured in European waters. To be sure, Spain was at that time technically a neutral, but in view of her alliance with France, which was in turn the ally of the Americans against England, Spain was willing to allow American armed ships to use the use of her ports. Moreover, the Derbys had never done any business in France and had no connections there, so that it was only natural for Mr. Derby to instruct Captain Pratt to use Bilbao as a base, knowing the Guadalquivir would give the Grand Turk's affairs the best attention. On the 16th of December, the Grand Turk and her two prizes anchored in Bilbao harbor, and Captain Pratt lost no time in paying his respects to the Gardoki's. Regarding his arrival, they wrote as follows to Mr. Derby, quote, "Since the above duplicate of our last salutations to you, Captain Joseph Pratt of your privateer ship, the Grand Turks, has placed in our hands your always esteemed and agreeable favor of the 26th of October, and as he came in safe over our board on the 16th, with a couple of good prizes, we most cordially and affectionately congratulate your good self and concerned on this very happy and successful event, and sincerely wish that before ever he completes his cruise, he may be fortunate enough to send home or here half dozen more." End quote. Quote, "One of Captain Pratt's prizes will in all probability be one of the richest prizes that has been brought here this war. She is a large ship with upwards of 900 hogsheads of sugar some coffee and campeche wood. The master informs us that as he took her on the coast of Ireland, so night the land where he set all her crew ashore, he had no time to be informed of the particulars of her cargo. She loaded at Jamaica and sailed without convoy for England, and was captured by young Grand Turk within 3 leagues of Cork. Captain Pratt had the prudence to convoy her to this port, and on his navigation took a small brig load bound from England home with both which he came safe here. End quote. The guard of keys now began negotiations for the sale of the prizes and their cargo, and as there happened to be a demand for the goods as well as a very active market for the purchase of vessels of all sorts, the result was that the net proceeds of the sale of the ships and cargoes came to no less than 820,276 reals. This, according to the letter from Captain Pratt, was then equivalent to about $41,000. One half of this amount was turned over in cash to Captain Pratt and his adventurous crew, and the other half, less the ship's expenses at Bilbo, was remitted to Mr. Derby in Salem. The Grand Turk remained in Bilbo Harbor for about 3 months while these transactions were being settled. During this period of inactivity in port, the crew spent much time ashore, and discipline was hard to maintain, so that when the Grand Turk was ready to sail, Captain Pratt had difficulty in getting his men to put to sea again. The privateer's crew was by no means easy to handle. Such a vessel had to carry several times the number of men necessary for her own manning in order to provide crews for the prizes captured. This large and often undisciplined and unruly crowd, cooped up as they were in extremely close quarters in a small vessel, were frequently able to assert themselves against the captain's will. Particularly was this so in the Grand Turk's case, where the crew had enjoyed a profitable cruise and had made enough money to satisfy their wants for the time being, and were not anxious to exchange the pleasures of shore life for the arduous life of the sea. But after the more reckless tars had spent most of their prize money, Captain Pratt was finally able to get his men together on March 13th, 1782, the Grand Turk once more weighed anchor and set sail. Good luck still followed her. On May the 4th, 1782, she arrived in Salem by way of the West Indies and reported the capture of her on her homeward trip of 3 more British vessels, the schooner Triton, the schooner Primrose, and the brigantine Thomas and Betsy. And from an account showing the settlement of the proceeds of these prizes dated at Salem in June, it appears that they netted 3960 with an L there. It is fairly safe to assume that this one voyage alone more than rapid the Grand Turk was fortunate owner for her coast, and no doubt was the means of setting up many of her crew in comfortable circumstances for the rest of their lives. At the same time, she rendered a valuable service to the American cause in harassing British commerce and in carrying the war up to the very shores of Great Britain. As a result of this most successful voyage, there arose an interesting complication, the story of which has come down through several letters by Messrs. Gardoki to Mr. Derby on August 6, 1782, about 7 months after the Grand Turk had brought her prizes into Bilbao, and 3 or 4 months after Gardoki and Sons had remitted the proceeds of the sales to Mr. Derby. They wrote him that, quote, without our notice, our knowledge we received from the Court of Commissary of Marine in order to make us pay without delay a monstrous and exorbitant sum of reals, 245,930, as duties on the cargoes of two prizes, the John and Grace, and the Mary, made by the Grand Turk Pratt. This duty amounted to about 30% of the value of the prizes, and as Messrs. Gardoki had already remitted Mr. Derby the proceeds, far from profiting by handling this successful business for Mr. Derby, they stood to lose a very large sum of money unless he sent them the necessary funds. But Mr. Derby refused to meet their request to pay the duties, and as events turned around, it was just as well that he took this stand, as is shown by the following letter written by the Gardokis some 6 months later. Alias Haskett Derby, Esquire, Salem. Dear Sir, we have the pleasure to acknowledge ourselves indebted to your always agreeable and esteemed lines of the 2nd of October and 30th of December last, in reply whereof must inform you, with respect to the duties laid on the two prizes made by the Grand Turks and their cargoes, that no affair of any kind whatsoever in this world has ever given us 1/4 of the trouble, vexation, and fatigue as this. We never expected to free ourselves from the repeated orders to pay the exorbitant sum laid on them, but at most to obtain by our interest at court a diminution a diminution of said duties, such as a fourth or at most a third thereof. In these expectations we resolved to represent to the Prime Ministers of the State, Indies, and Finances, through whose preferments this your House has and is always employed in the execution of every affair that the Ministry wants, parentheses, our services to the Crown without the least interest at, as they well knew, and accordingly requested that in consideration to them they might be pleased to free us from the payment thereof. This representation was sent by us direct to the ministers, of whom we have the happiness to respond, but being necessary that all our friends at court should also use their interests for the purpose, we made the best effort and employed every one of them with orders to spend any money to obtain a happy end. In consequence of this resolution, we had the very high satisfaction of receiving a letter from His Excellency, the Prime Minister of Finances, that the services of this your House to the Crown having been fully represented to the King by him, and the rest of the ministers, His Majesty, in consideration to them, had been pleased to free the two prizes and their cargoes of the whole duties laid laterally on them, on which little expected but happy event we most cordially congratulate you and are carefully satisfied and pleased that our services to the crown have been the means of saving you and the captors such a large sum of money, besides the immense trouble that we have had in the course of this affair, having been obliged to disperse here and at court rails 29,267 of valor. We have placed this sum in your debit, which beg you crediting us for. Your most obt and humble servants, Jose Gardoki and Sons. To this letter, Mr. Derby replied that the transaction had been closed on his books many months before, and that the money spent by the Gardokis for influence at court was no affair of his. However, moreover, he was dissatisfied with the rates of exchange used by the Spanish firm in sending him the original remittance, and felt that they owed him more than the sum they were demanding. The dispute dragged on for several years. In 1785, Don Diego Gardoki arrived in New York as Spanish ambassador to the United States and wrote Mr. Derby that he needed funds with which to buy a house and to establish himself, and asked that the old debt be paid to him in New York. Mr. Derby, however, continued obstinate and throughout his life refused to settle, and even after his death the next generation of Gardokis was still vainly trying in 1802 to obtain settlement from Mr. Derby's executors. So far as known, the account was never paid, and as a result of this incident, Mr. Derby broke off his business relationships with this great mercantile house, which could influence the decisions of King Charles III of Spain, and the Derbys' long and prosperous trade with Bilbo ended. But to return once more to the Grand Turk, as already related, she arrived in Salem from her most successful second cruise on May the 9th, 1782. In July, she set out again to comb the seas for further spoils, and returned in September with two prizes, the ship Anne and the brigantine Rambler. The statement of settlement of the sale of these two prizes is the only record extant regarding this third cruise. In the fall of 1782, the Grand Turk once more sailed from Salem in command